We just played in a previous segment Minouche Shafiq's statement from Columbia University. She is the Columbia president, of course. And one of the responses here I found especially interesting. So this is a video that Steven Donziger tweeted out. He says, breaking, this brilliant speech yesterday by a Columbia professor on the cowardice of the university administration in calling in police to arrest students will be cited throughout history and will inspire generations of students for decades to come. Columbia is still on lockdown 2 days later. So we're going to take a look at this video here. So this was after the cops came in, raided Hamilton Hall, broke up the encampments. This is Professor Rashid Khalidi outside expressing his contempt for the way that these protests were handled.
This is Rashid Khalidi. I'm the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University. I've been teaching here for a total of 22 years. When I was a student back in the 60s, we were told we were led by a bunch of outside agitators, by politicians nobody remembers the name of today. We were the conscience of this nation when we opposed the Vietnam War and racism back in 1968 and 1969 and 1970. The Vietnam War stopped because the people opposed it, and the people who led that were students. And the students who led that were here at Columbia and at Berkeley and a few other campuses on this fair Turtle Island. Students have been on the right side of history at Columbia and at other universities ever since the 1960s. We today honor the students who in 1968 opposed a genocidal, illegal, shameful war. Columbia University honors them. They're on the Columbia website. You can check it out yourself.
Okay. Just going to plant a flag there because we're going to investigate this in a moment. I'll let this go a little bit longer.
1968 is commemorated. One day, what our students did here will be commemorated in the same way. Yeah! They are and they were on the right side of history.
Okay, so he mentions, hey, anti-war protesters, especially at these campuses, have been on the right side of history throughout all of these conflicts, all of these protests. We look back on them with great fondness here at Columbia University. You can even see a tribute to the 1968 protests and occupation on our website. So I decided to look into this a little bit. So I put into the Google machine, columbia.edu, which is their website, 1968, since I wanted to find an example of what he was talking about. And sure enough, item 1, page 1, first thing there, Columbia University, 1968. I say, oh, great. He's right. Let's check it out. Oops. Object not found. The requested URL was not found on this server. The link seems to be wrong or outdated. An expired link. Interesting. So I put that expired link into the archive, which, bookmarks links so that there is a record of them after they are expired. I want to see, okay, which article about the 1968 protest did Columbia delete? Now, in fairness, I don't know when they took this down. We only know that this page has been taken down. So this is the page that's no longer available on their website by a guy named Frank DeCruz. And there's that print is a little fine there, but we'll do the best we can here. I won't read the whole thing. So this article here is Personal Recollections of the 1968 Student Uprising. I was an active participant, but not a member of any particular faction. The only organization I belonged to was Veterans Against the War. I wrote this article for publication in the Columbia Librarian at the request of Columbia's Vice President for Information Services and University Librarian Elaine Sloan, then my boss's boss, on the 30th anniversary of the Student Rebellion. So he wrote this in 1998. And as you can see, this was updated as recently as August 2019, so it seems to have been up there as of fairly recently that we know. This is not up there at the moment. As you can see, gives a documented history, the prelude, the first occupations, right? Goes on for quite a length of time. Here is the conclusion that he draws. For most of us, the Columbia strike of 1968 was about moral issues. The Vietnam War, racism at home, and Columbia's role in each. Sound familiar? We were right. Everybody else was wrong. 50 years later, everybody else is still wrong. So this was updated. This was 2018, 50 years later. The United States is indisputably the most destructive nation on earth since Nazi Germany. Morality is a forgotten concept. There are no moral leaders in this country. The USA is guilty of too many crimes to list here, but foremost among them is the endless killing of people and toppling of governments all over the world to further, quote, American interests. The last moral leader the USA knew was Martin Luther King. When he began to speak openly about the Vietnam War and of social and economic justice right next door at Riverside Church just a year before the Columbia strike, he was killed. Since then, nobody has stood up to take his place. In fact, every prominent leader who posed a serious threat to the Vietnam War was assassinated. JFK, Malcolm X, MLK, and finally, RFK. This country and the planet itself are spiraling into Armageddon. Can we stop it? The kinds of mass movements and open rebellion that made some difference in the 1960s don't happen anymore, or if they do, they have no effect. American government at every level, as well as the two-party system, are utterly corrupt, the electoral system non-functional, the population torn by hatred, depression, despair, and addiction. Okay, then he talks about his tenure on the Bernie Sanders campaign. As you can see, this is a pretty radical guy drawing a pretty radical conclusion in staunch defense of the 1968 anti-war protests and, yes, occupations, making a point that he's on the right side of history. This piece is now no longer on the Columbia.edu website.
I
Once
think
again,
the rest of that is worth reading. I know you're a good reader. You can get away with it.
all right, where is it? Even if elections were fair, open, and honest, at least 40% of the electorate is openly racist, and the other 60% probably most feel threatened by radical Islamic terrorism and favor the wars, the security state, the drones, and all the rest. The best hope we had for meaningful change, Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign, was squashed like a bug. 50 years ago, I could never have predicted a world like this. In 1968 and the years that followed, we tried to fix things, and the world has been engulfed in the backlash to 1968 as well as to the Civil Rights Movement and FDR's New Deal ever since. I don't know what else to say except to recall what we were taught as children: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. A simple rule. What became of it? So pretty radical stuff.
I think at a moment like that, hearing that kind of perspective from an elder and a veteran of these kinds of movements, to see what he thinks about the world we live in and the perspective he has on how we got here, and seeing it very much as a reaction to the movements he was involved in as a young man. It's very interesting. It's definitely something we on the left who are trying to fight these battles now, we need more people like this. We need more voices like this. Very often, it's like a bunch of kids running around trying to figure it out, and it's partly because of what he's saying. There are no moral leaders. You need people with some age, some wisdom, some perspective to help to guide these things.
Well, yes, and that would be a nice reference to have on the Columbia University website, but it's not there anymore, is it? Now, do we know that they deleted that in response to these encampments? No, we can't prove that. The timing is a little suspicious, and what makes me even more suspicious is this. Okay, so this makes me even more suspicious that they buried that in response to these encampments. If you look at page 1, item 2 on the Google search, Columbia.edu 1968, you see Columbia University Archives 1968 Crisis. When was this updated? 5 days ago, which would have been April 30th, right? Which would have been the day of the raid, right? That was the 30th, right?
Well, and literally the anniversary of the 1968 raid.
Okay, so their archives on the 1968 protests were updated on the day of the raid. That article's gone. Let's see what they have now in its place. Columbia University Archives 1968 Crisis. This is if you click that link. What if the university and the Columbia Spectator had used Twitter to report on the protests and rallies of 1968 in real time? To commemorate the student-led protests at Columbia in 1968, the University Archives retold the events through modern social media during the spring semester of 2018, and it links you to this piece here, which is something that they had put together, I believe, in 2008. But as you can see here, this archive updated April 30th, 2024, just so happens to be the day that they broke up the police archive. So what I want to know, and maybe the answer to this is no, and fair enough, but I think it's reasonable to suggest that they may have scrapped this radical defense of the 1968 protests as these protests were happening because they didn't want to get caught with this literature on their website when, of course, we know this guy makes explicit mention, hey, if you check our website.
City honors them. They're on the Columbia website.
They're on the Columbia website.
1968 is commemorated.
Well, look, something's fishy about that, I say. That might be a little scoop, what we call. I don't know. Like I said, I don't know for a fact. That timing is awfully coincidental, I think.
And I would be willing to lay good money that you're right, that they recently pulled this down, because and this is what we've been talking about since October 8th. The establishment wanted to paint itself as being on the side of past radical movements that we today recognize as having been in the right. Because, of course, what are you going to do? Paint yourself as being opposed to past radical movements that we recognize as being in the right? Of course. You're going to tell these guys, yes, we support all of those ideals. That was all well and good until it happened in real time, until it happened now. This is why these October 7th has torn apart the illusion that the establishment is left. That's absurd. Whatever they want to be saying at the dissident dialogues, they're all on the same page when it comes to war, when it comes to imperialism, when it comes to having a hedge fund economy. They're all on the same page. They're all run by the same people. They all work. Elon Musk versus Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos, or for that matter, George Soros. This is just an aristocracy that is uniform in its agreement that society should be arranged as an aristocracy, having disagreements and quibbles about manners and process and organizational charts. That's all that is.
Yeah, indeed.
These kids all of a sudden realized that that's all it is, and that's a problem, and that's why they had to crush it so fast. Look, all these people on the right, and had nothing but contempt for the BLM protests. And okay, so their contempt for these protests is consistent, but they don't seem to ever stop and ask themselves, why did we let the much more destructive BLM riots happen? These burned down neighborhoods, right? Burned down police stations. And they crack down on this right away.
Yeah.
Right away. Why was that allowed to happen and why was this not? Because the BLM riots, they knew were never going to really amount to any structural, meaningful change in the way that our society is run. Whereas this, now you're fucking with money, you're fucking with arms dealers, you're fucking with our geopolitical vision, you're fucking with the real shit, man. You can have big BLM burn all the shit down you want. That'll just help them when they have to explain why they're not actually going to defund the police.
Right, then they'll get the Nixon backlash and the Reagan backlash. Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
Please clap.